record this. Okay, so we're focusing on night for this session. We only have one session on the exam, and this is it. Okay, so get your exam, practice exam out, and you guys are all going to contribute to a plan for the question on night. We might do 2 questions on night. We'll see how we go. We might even write up an introduction. Did we write an introduction up when we did night to begin with?
Yeah.
We did? Okay.
I think I've misplaced my copies.
Okay. So the question asks us, Night by Elie Wiesel explores the devastating impact death, inhumanity and suffering has on the human spirit. Discussed. So write that down, write that on a bit of paper, and we're going to plan it all out together. Okay?
I don't know, Georgia. Then just shut up. I don't know what you're doing. Wait.
Okay, so we've written that down. Now we need to unpack the question. A text response essay requires us to consider the wording of the question and to develop an appropriate response in essay form using really formal language, looking at key words within the question, coming up with 3 key ideas about the topic. Okay, so what are key words in this question?
Inhumanity, suffering,
Okay, human spirit, and maybe devastating impact and death. Okay, so we'll unpack these one at a time. So tell me about devastating impact. We can group those 2 words together. Death, inhumanity and suffering has on the human spirit. So devastating impact. If we're thinking of the consequence of all these things, what can we say in terms of devastating impact?
what it led to.
Okay, so Elie's transformation, do you think?
Yep, because he experienced that.
So from the young boy of the Talmud, look, it's all coming back to us.
What's the
The Talmud is an ancient book of prayer. Remember, there's a lot of Jewish terms that are associated with this text, so re-familiarise yourself with the vocab. So he's a young boy of the Talmud. He's a devout worshipper and believer in God's magnificence and omnipotence. Okay, so this is the young Elie, okay, the young boy who grows up in the town of Szeged on the Hungarian border, and he strongly believes that God's mysticism is something that is going to be part of his life.
Miss Hando, what does omnipotence mean?
Omnipotent means all-powerful.
And what is the exact word?
Yeah, an all-powerful, all-loving God. So if we think of an omnipotent God, it's an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful God who pretty much...
I know what the word is. I always thought it was omnipotent, and I didn't know how to pronounce it.
Okay, omnipotent. There we go. Does that make sense? So if we think of Elie's view of God and his faith and belief in God's goodness, we know that that's transformed. So Elie's transformation from the young boy of the Talmud to maybe a cynical unbeliever. All right, that's going to be one of the consequences. If we look at devastating, I suppose that is inferred there in terms of that transformation. So we see the young boy at the beginning of the text, this 14-year-old hopeful boy who is optimistic about the future. At the end, we've got this vacant boy who looks at himself in the mirror and sees a corpse staring back at him. So that symbolically reflects the transformative effect of the Holocaust on his faith in God. and humanity as well. So we can extend our discussion to include not only a shift in his thinking about God, but a shift in his thinking about the belief in mankind itself. All right, so there's a couple of things going on there. So a cynical unbeliever, I'll put God and humanity perhaps. There. Okay, so let's move on. So we've got death, inhumanity and suffering. So where does he see death? Who dies, and what are the consequences of that? Sort of put the consequences in there. So if we just focus on death.
First and foremost, his own family, so his mother and sisters, and later on his father.
Okay.
And
Mother.
He doesn't witness his mum and sister's death, so
Okay, so we've got
They die.
Zipporah and Bea and Hilda. There's some names again. We've just got men to the left
yeah. And he never sees them.
and women to the right.
which one?
They die.
Okay, so don't just form that conclusion that he knows that they've died and hence that impacts on him, but there's that uncertainty. Okay, so the uncertainty of their fate impacts on him. Okay, who else dies?
His father, later on.
So father, final pages of the
Also,
book.
the angel-faced boy stood out to him.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Is that
Okay, the young Pipel.
Yeah.
Okay, the yeah, we'll remember in a minute. He's the Polish capo's helper, and he's a kindly young boy. Okay, so let's go back to the father who dies in the final pages of the book of dysentery, or a condition that is brought on by the unsanitary conditions of the camp. And his death, remember, is met with relief by Elie, who says that if he could have perhaps summarised his feelings at the time, he would have described them as being feelings of relief, at last freedom, I think he says. So there's all that guilt about his feeling of abandoning his father. So you might put that in. There's a heap you could talk about in regards to that if you wanted to develop that idea in terms of his transformation, because he believes that he himself has failed the test, doesn't he? And what is the test? I guess it's about resisting the temptation to allow self-interest to prevail. Does that make sense? You know, to care for his father and his peers in a way that puts their interests before his. And he certainly believes in the end that he's failed the test. Not that he's done anything, but just because he had that feeling of relief and freedom at last, he thinks that he has succumbed to the conditions that he's forced into. Right, so there's the death of his father. Then there's the death of the Pipel. So on the gallows. What is it about the death of the young Pipel at this point in time that impacts him so significantly? How does he die?
Public killing.
Yep, okay, so we've got the public hanging.
And
Everyone has to go and look him in the eye. don't they?
he didn't
Yeah.
die quickly. He was still alive and writhing on the end of the rope when Elie had to look at him. Apparently he was also angelic
Yep,
in nature and appearance.
it takes a long time to die.
Yeah. Didn't it say like over half an hour he was just
Mhm.
writhing there?
And that night the soup tasted like corpses.
Yeah.
There were other hangings, so you could even suggest that in some ways he becomes immune to death, So that impacts on him as well. So you could suggest that there's examples where death impacts him profoundly, but there's also examples where he's desensitized to death. We can talk about that in a minute.
What does that say?
Tasted like corpses.
Oh, it takes a long time.
Okay, you got it?
Yep.
All right, this is an interesting discussion. So what can we say about the way that he, in some senses, becomes immune to death and suffering?
Well, there was that one instance, remember, and somebody died, and he said that night the soup tasted better than ever. But I can't remember who died before he said that. Can you remember the event before that?
Okay, so
Do you remember the
Yep.
thing I'm talking about?
there was, again, it was an example of some public hangings, and
But they didn't affect him.
no, that night the soup tasted delicious.
Yeah, so that night the soup tasted better than ever, I think.
Yeah,
Or something
because
like
he
that.
forgets straight away that the hangings have happened.
Yeah,
He's driven by hunger.
yeah, but after the pal boy, mentioned how they taste.
You've written death twice. You've written becomes immune to death suffering.
Thank you.
I just did this for death.
Yeah, we're still on death. Thanks, Bella, because we're separating it up. All right.
I don't know if that was before or after the death.
I think it'll be chapter 5 or chapter 4. Fear was greater than hunger. Okay, page 63. I remember that on that evening the soup tasted better than ever. The capos forced everyone to look him squarely in the face. Okay, so you might want to have a look at that example if you're interested in comparing and contrasting his different responses to death. That's on page 63. I forget the exact circumstances. Okay, so page 63, the soup tasted better than ever. Okay. Right, so do you reckon we've covered death?
Yeah.
Okay, inhumanity. So keyword inhumanity, I'll put it over here. What can we say about examples of inhumanity? What do we see? Remember, we've got suffering. Maybe we put inhumanity and brutality together as a description of behaviour that's inhuman. What can we say about inhumanity then? Okay, so treatment of the Jews by the SS.
Yep.
So dehumanisation. What's that mean?
That's all of the disinfecting and the shaving and the putting them in the same clothes and doing all of that, so to take away their individual identity, so that they kind of have to act as a unit.
Yep.
And it stops people from kind of, like breaking out of form and doing something.
Yep. Okay, you could even talk about the way that they're forced to run in lines, the selections.
Yeah, just for the fun of it, as well. And yeah, I think they do they do running and make them like run? Just I
Yep.
think they did it just for their entertainment sometimes.
Okay, and then fear, the constant threat, the constant fear of death, which is linked to death, but you know it's staying alive, that becomes a kind of game.
Also, I think the hunger dehumanises them
Yep.
as well, doesn't it?
Hunger. So fear is stronger than hunger, but hunger is nonetheless a driving force. Okay, so we could talk about specific examples, but there's probably enough to go on there that you can look back at the novel and find plenty yourself, do you think?
Yep.
Yep, so can you remember, for example, what number Elie's given? What number's tattooed onto his arm? A77134,
I knew I had something.
something like that.
Just remember that.
Well, let's just, you should be able to remember that. That's pretty simple.
Have you reread the book recently?
No.
Wow, you legend.
77134.
Right, I think that's it. Goodness me, I'm probably wrong now.
No, don't worry. Before this, I thought you were a legend. I was like, yeah, she must.
Right,
have
well,
reread it.
you could have, I might be wrong and then I'll completely shatter your thoughts.
Like I said, before you step back into it.
Right. Okay, legendary status is,
Has been achieved by Miss Hando.
okay, let's move right on. So, if anyone can find it, I'll give them a lolly. Okay. So, in humanity, we've covered. What about suffering? What do we see in the way of suffering?
What they go through, pain.
Okay.
The journey.
The cold.
Okay.
A7713.
I added a 4 on the end. Thank you. So the cold.
The status hasn't been moved.
Okay. Or maybe we could talk about the physical and emotional. And psychological. And we'll leave that at that. It all will become enmeshed. Okay. So we've got examples of the way that hunger impacts on human behaviour as well, in terms of the things that people will do, the lengths that people will go to satisfy their desire for food. So remember the air raid when the Russians fly overhead and people just go for the soup and they're shot down.
Yeah.
So desperate are they to get food. And remember the example in the cattle cart on the Liberation Front as they're moving back through Germany, and the Germans throw them bits of food, and fathers of sons fight their fathers to the death for a scrap of bread. Can you remember that?
Yeah.
So that's another example of suffering, I suppose, or inhumanity. The two could be linked there. Okay, so if we move on then to look at human spirit. Right, I'll get rid of this and we'll talk about what is meant by the human spirit, and we'll connect the transformation to the human spirit. So what is human spirit? What does that mean? Because I think it embraces or encapsulates a number of different things.
Well, part of it would be his spirituality.
Okay.
And his belief in God and humanity and that sort of thing. So I think part of that would probably come into that category. I suppose some of it would be like his will to live.
Yep.
And I don't know, like his well-being, his mental state.
He doesn't give up much.
Yeah, okay, so will to live, what do you call that? Survival instinct.
Yeah. And in some people it was crushed, and you could probably
Yeah.
give examples of that.
Well,
The people-
hope, we'll put hope there.
The people who never woke up from the snow and
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Okay. All right, good. All right, I think that's covered human spirit. So if we were to try and work out a plan that had 3 main dot points for this essay discussion, what's it going to be?
Inhumanity.
Okay. All right, so we need to start perhaps with a description of inhumanity, suffering, do you think? All right, and death, okay, we can go with that. So, we'll write this down as a paragraph structure. Now, interestingly, you could either group inhumanity, suffering and death together as one paragraph, or you could break it up and have death and then inhumanity and suffering. What do you think? You think that would work better because we had a lot to say about death?
Also, death kind of can impact the suffering, and the inhumanity can impact the human spirit.
Yeah, okay. That's pretty easy, isn't it? Like if you look at the key wording of the question and you're simply organising it in a way that then enables you to develop a paragraph on each of these key focus areas. And you need to discuss, which means to talk about it. Okay, so you're not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with the question, you're exploring the implications of the question. Would anybody else organise those paragraphs differently?
Like I said, I would possibly combine death and suffering, and somehow maybe inhumanity and human spirit. I'm not sure what would be a third or something, but I think there's a really clear link there.
If you remember in your essays at the beginning of the year, a lot of the starting points for discussion in the first paragraph were about Elie's faith and what he was like at the beginning of the text and then what he was like at the end. So sometimes we started a first body paragraph by looking at the kind of person he was before the Holocaust, then the kind of person he becomes during the Holocaust. So you could put human spirit up there if you wanted to, and then come back to it. You could even have 4 body paragraphs if you wanted to show what he's like at the beginning, then death, then inhumanity and suffering, and then what he's like at the end. That's up to you. Do you want to write an introduction for this? All right, and we'll see if you guys can feed into it, remembering what it is that we need to include in an introduction. How do we start it off?
Night by Elie, Wiesel.
Yep, and then we explain the question. Yeah. So if we start with or just some background information about the text and its narrative style.
Yeah. It's a memoir written using hindsight.
Okay, so Elie Wiesel's retrospective. In the past, thinking back about the events that have happened.
You improve our vocabulary so much.
What's the tell note again? Okay, Elie Wiesel's retrospective memoir, Night, reveals to readers, or what does it do? Documents, explores, examines? Documents, because it is kind of documentary. We'll go with documents. What does it document? Do you want to use some key wording from the question now?
The effects of death and suffering, and inhumanity on the human spirit.
Remember, reword the question. So the consequences of the Holocaust. And it's devastating. Maybe start with we'll have that in a different sentence.
The effects of the Holocaust and the devastating impact
on human spirit.
Can you say that again, Josh?
The documents the consequential effects of the Holocaust and the devastating impact on human spirit.
The consequential effects?
The Holocaust has its devastating impact upon human spirit.
How about on the
Whatever.
human spirit? And then we'll say the devastating. Exposure to death, suffering, and what's the third one? And inhumanity transforms the central protagonist from, how does it transform him?
Well, you said it earlier. From a, hang on, I wrote this down. From a young boy of the Talmud to a cynical unbeliever in both God and humanity. But you can write that. That's what you said earlier, and it was pretty great.
Okay, so from a young devotee of the Talmud to what?
You said a cynical unbeliever in both God and humanity.
Okay, we might just have a full stop, otherwise we're getting too long-winded, and we can then break it up into God and humanity. So, Elie's faith in both God and humanity shifts as, can we list some of the things that he is exposed to?
Well, first his forced out of the ghetto, separated from his mother and sisters.
As he
Separated from his family, all by his father. Forced out of the ghetto,
as he is separated from his family.
dehumanized via means of shaving and numbering and disinfecting, and giving clothes to wear, the same clothes as everybody else.
Okay, so Ellie's faith in both God and humanity shifts as he is separated from his family. What's the next thing?
He's dehumanized.
Okay, so dehumanized by SS officers who systematically
Or who attempt to systematically exterminate all of the Jews.
not exterminate, but I'm talking about the process of dehumanization.
Who systematically remove Alie's individuality.
What was your sentence, Ash? Okay, what's the next bit? Have we got death there?
Yeah. Not very well.
Where's death?
Exposure to death.
We've already got that. Okay, how can we finish this off? I'll read it out again. Elie Wiesel's retrospective memoir, Night, documents the consequential effects the Holocaust has on the human spirit. The devastating exposure to death, suffering and inhumanity transforms the central protagonist from a young devotee of the Talmud to a cynical unbeliever. Elie's faith in both God and humanity shifts as he is separated from his family, dehumanized by SS officers who systematically strip him of his individuality. But we're coming back to death because we've sort of put it up there, but we haven't explored it in great detail. And something about the real threat of death. Did we use the word expose? Yeah. And
I don't know, his witness to innumerable deaths around him, or, you know,
Okay.
say something like that, his witness to, or as his peers are the victims of.
You got something, Ash? Who systematically strip him of his individuality and something about the fear of death. Again, the word expose, but a different word. The very real threat of death.
Do we?
And entrench in Elie.
Okay. What would you say, Bella?
No, because I don't know what entrench is. I'm saying grave.
Yeah, engrave's good too. That's probably better. Something about the reality of death, or the fear of death, the constant fear of death. Okay, so now might be an opportunity. Do we agree that he's totally transformed? Is there any kind of hint at salvation or redemption? Not even redemption, but of the some kind of characteristics of the young Elie being evident or not?
Yeah, he's always just a little unsure. I don't know, I talked about this last time, but remember how he used to say that, you know, he didn't believe, you know, how can there be a God when this is happening? But he reported feeling that empty feeling when he decided to kind of cut God off, and, you know, he was never entirely.
Okay, so maybe we suggest that despite what?
Despite his claims, despite
Yeah.
his. It is debatable as to whether Elie is ever fully relinquishes all belief in God, or relinquishes all faith in God, or something like that.
Not even contesting the notion of his faith, but his sense of human decency as a person, that perhaps we as the readers are still encouraged to believe in his essential goodness. Okay, so maybe despite his claims to the contrary, Elie's memoir indicates to readers that the consequences
What does that say, despite his claims to the contrary?
to the contrary, Elie's memoir indicates to readers that the consequences of the Holocaust are not a total renunciation, do not result Okay, so despite his claims to the contrary, Elie's memoir indicates to readers that the consequences of the Holocaust do not result in a total renunciation of his, what? Humanity? Have we used the word humanity? Human spirit?
We haven't used humanity, so we could do that.
All right, we'll put humanity there.
Put Elie's faith in God, humanity.
Okay, yep, all right, so you could explore that further on. Good. All right, is it all coming back to you now? Yep. Okay. So did you get that intro down?
Just finished. Please don't like
All right. So finish that, and then we might just quickly look at the next question.
You could do the next question on that board.
Okay.
So what does it say? Result in a total
Renunciation. So that's to take away everything about himself that previously existed. Remember, we're talking about that word testimony, and in testifying about his ordeal, he's actually doing a lot to bear witness to the horrific events that he endures. So by writing, he's giving of himself to ensure that this erroneous piece of history is never repeated. So
What does
that's
erroneous mean?
error. Okay, so the next one is key moments. Just attempt, the first question will be the easier question, the second one's going to be the harder question. The second question will ask you to think about the way the text is structured. The first question will be more about the ideas and the themes in the text. So if that's helpful for you, just make a little mental note about that. Read the first question and probably do the first question.
So we'll have to do this analytical essay on night.
Yep.
We'll have to create a speech with arguments in response to an article that we'll read.
You will, but the form may not necessarily be a speech. Okay, so if we're thinking of form, it could be a letter to the editor, it could be a comment, it could be an opinion piece. Read the information carefully. Just because the practice one asks you to do a speech doesn't mean that the next one will.
We
Okay?
haven't really done all of that though.
No, we haven't. So that's a little bit of a tricky thing for you to do, but by the same token, you've already done a persuasive piece of writing in the form of a speech, so it won't be dissimilar in that regard.
Yeah.
Okay?
And so we'll also have to do a language analysis.
You will.
So
There's
we'll
those
do
three
three
parts.
things.
That's right. Yeah.
Time will be squishy.
Yes. Yeah. 3 hours and 15 minutes
Oh,
reading
is it
time.
really 3 hours?
Yeah. So it's a 3-hour exam. Okay, so
Oh, okay. Alright,
Okay.
Phew, I thought it was like an hour and something.
no. 3 hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's have a look here. 3 hours writing time and 15 minutes reading time.
Alright, well that's nice.
Okay. Okay, let's look at this, and I know a lot of you won't tackle the second question, but it's really worth considering the wording here because it might cue you into some of that symbolic language that you didn't do in your first essay. So remember examining the way that those literary devices are used is something that many of you didn't really do all that convincingly. So let's look at this and see if you can include some in your planning. So key moments in the text, as well as the repeated use of symbols and imagery throughout night, show the effect of brutality on human behaviour. Okay, give me some comments about keywords.
Symbols.
Imagery.
Yep.
Effect. Maybe.
Yep.
Brutality.
Where did effects go?
Effect and
Yep.
brutality. Right.
Brutality. Behaviour.
Okay.
Human bad.
Right, and probably key moments. So can anybody tell me what those key moments are? If we're thinking of some fairly transformative or important moments in the text, what might they be?
That relates to symbols and imagery?
Well, key moments in the text,
Oh, okay.
the use of symbols, the use of imagery. There's 3 things there. So each of those can become important. So what are we going to think of in terms of key moments? If I'm thinking of a key moment, I'm thinking of that first night at Auschwitz. Never shall I forget that night that turned my dreams to ash, 10 times sealed, etc. The emphasis on that repetition of the word never, 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 okay? Walking past the pit of burning children. So I would say that's pretty profound.
Yeah.
Okay. Can anybody else think of a moment in the text that they remember? Use some of those examples from before, the young Papel, perhaps.
The beating he received.
Yep. From IDEC.
Yeah, that bloke.
Okay. The first human words, perhaps as well. We'll come back to that.
French
So,
girl.
beating.
Were they from
I
the French girl?
No, that was from the capo, the Polish capo.
Oh yeah, the one that was really nice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Look after one another. That's what he tells them. Have faith in each other. That's how you will survive. That's the kind of summary of what he says. And then, what's the young French girl? What does she say? Dry your eyes, little brother. Okay. What is the exact wording? So the young French girl.
Something I remember was when the son of the rabbi, how his son purposely left him.
Okay, so Rabbi Eliahu's son.
And how he was looking for him, thinking that it was a mistake, but the son knew what he was doing, and how Elie saw that and he prayed that he wouldn't do the same.
Yep. An involuntary or impromptu prayer. Because he doesn't believe in God at this point in time, but something stirs within him to make him pray this prayer that he won't do the same as Rabbi Eliahu's son. Okay, so there's a few key moments you can remember. Remember things that stand out to you. Okay, they're going to be important if they stand out. So that shouldn't be too hard to do. Go and have a look